The Rings of Power, Episode 8, concludes this first season of this fantasy show, this show that is supposedly adapting the appendices of The Return of the King from J.R.R. Tolkien, which it doesn't. But for now, it is over for at least half a year or more. I don't know when they are planning to release season 2, but it is a given that it will take at least 5 seasons until we're done with Amazon's The Rings of Power. So, this final episode is basically divided in 3 storylines. There's one minor storyline regarding Númenor, there's one larger storyline regarding the hobbits and Gandalf, and then there's the storyline concerning Galadriel and the rest of our elven friends. So I'm going to start off with the hobbits. So Discount Gandalf arrives in Eregion, or the Greenwood, which will later be known as Mirkwood, but as we will see, there's still, there's nothing, there's no life in this forest at all. So no birds, no, uh, no, I mean little creatures like rabbits, or foxes, or bears, or wolves, or there aren't even elves or human settlers nearby. So it's basically a dead forest already. Um, but the stranger, or this Count Gandalf, still has Nori's apple, and he's like reflecting on her words that he is not peril, when he sees someone who runs after it, and he loses his apple, and he sees suddenly a little hand taking the apple, and of course you would suspect that Nori or her friends have arrived on the scene. But yeah, this is very creepy. uh, you see immediately that this is a Nori. This is more like the kid in the first episode of Game of Thrones, like the one that was nailed to the tree by the White Walkers. So it turns out that it is the main of the three weirdos, and they just start bowing to him because they suspect that he is Sauron. That they've traveled a long way to see their master, Sauron, and maybe Discount Gandalf is Sauron. Will he be? We don't know. Um, so it's then basically where the intro starts and where we get into the rest of the episode. But continuing the storyline, they just talk about his powers a bit, saying that he needs to go to Rune, to the east, where there's this star, there's this constellation. So he needs to find it, and there he will learn about his powers. And he starts, whipping up some leaves, but the main weirdo throws some fairy dust in his face, and he falls asleep. And they start to bind him to a tree. Luckily, help is on the way because Sadok was hiding under a bunch of leaves and ferns, and the other hobbits aren't far away. So of course these guys, they notice it because they're not idiots, and the hobbits make a lot of noise. So while they're binding them, I mean, you see that there's only 2 of them. So where is the third one? Well, it turns out that Marigold finds the real Discount Gandalf, who is um, unconscious and just lying on the forest floor. So it actually is the main weirdo who has shapeshifted into Discount Gandalf, and Sadok tries to hold him back when Nori needs to run, but he gets knifed by one of the other weirdos. So just when you thought that we're finally gonna get rid of these annoying homicidal hobbits, um, the stranger Discount Gandalf, he's just whipping up his powers. He's like blasting the 3 weirdos with some leaves and wind, and of course the main weirdo, who is in control of her powers, overpowers him easily with her staff. Um, Meanwhile, the other hobbits try to run away, and Sadok just puts a knife into the foot of one of the other weirdos, and then Nori just manages, for some reason, to grab the staff of the main weirdo. Marigold and Poppy were just throwing rocks at her, so she drops her staff, Nori runs off with it, and then the main weirdo starts to just, fire breathe and set the forest on fire. Luckily, Nori is there to talk to the stranger about that it's not that you are not what other people say that you are. You are what you make yourself to be. So this is given in this episode. It is the main theme that the writers, they just pulled out all of the Facebook motivational quotes out for this episode. So in this case as well, of course, it helps, obviously. And just when the main weirdo wants to, fire breathe on Poppy, Marigold, and Sadok, and you think, yes, we're finally gonna get rid of him. Well, the fire goes out because Discount Gandalf has the staff, and it turns out that these three are wraiths of some kind, which is very odd. I mean, wraiths can exist because of necromancy and dark magic, as we see with the Barrow Wights in Fellowship of the Ring in the book. But it's very odd that they can then still take this shape, this more this nicer shape, this elven or human shape. So it's very odd, and also they can still use magic. So still it's kind of weird because they're extremely powerful. So you think of these wraiths, I suppose, and more similar on the level of the Witch King of Angmar, who was a ring wraith, and one of the main, lieutenants of Sauron, or his main lieutenant. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense as to how these wraiths are there, and how they are still possessive of such, magical powers. I mean, they should be with the actual Sauron, and if they are so powerful, they should have no trouble finding the actual Sauron, because this guy Gandalf just, blasts them away. They're just completely destroyed for now because they turn into butterflies. Unfortunately, Sadok is knifed. I mean, he's going to die. He let a lot of other Harfoots die, who went off trail or who were sick. So yeah, just leave this guy behind. I mean, it's not a good guy, and to be fair, there's really not much of character development in this Hobbit. So it's very easy just to let him die and forget about him. So we immediately also return to the grove where the other Harfoots are, and basically nobody is mourning Sadok. They're just, going about their business. So it's very weird as well that they're not like building a settlement here, because it's very fertile ground. It seems there's like little patches of of vegetable gardens. There's an orchard, so you could expand this. You could expand farming lands. You could build a mill somewhere. You could do a lot of stuff in this place, but they're just going to go around in their little track again, which doesn't really make sense. I mean, they're not really a people that migrate. They don't really have the same qualities and the same occupation as real people that migrate. They're not doing it for any reason. They just wander about for no reason at all. And I think, the writers also didn't think this through. They said, migrating people just, wander around, which they don't, but in this case they do. So Nori and Discount Gandalf are talking again, not about Sadok or any of the dead hobbits or what happened. So they just talk about what Istar means, because the three weirdos called him an Istar or Istari. So he then explains that he is a wizard. So it is actually Gandalf. And of course, we don't really know what Gandalf was up to in the Second Age, but we do know that he wasn't fighting Sauron. He at least isn't mentioned. He was only present from around the year 1000 of the Third Age. So prior to that, he was maybe in the east, maybe he was in Valinor, maybe he was somewhere else, maybe he was just chilling in the Proto-Shire with a brew of ale. So we don't know about it, but it's a fact that he wasn't involved in the main events of the Second Age. So what happens then is basically Malva taking over the hobbits. They're preparing to leave. Nori will go with the stranger, and the rest of them will go the other way. I mean, look at it. It's just it's a bit burned, but you can still make it work as a village. So there's plenty of space for all of them. So why not just stay there? It looks kind of peaceful and fertile. So there's no reason to leave this place. And also, I mean, they have nothing left. So why just not stay there? I mean, build some permanent settlement or semi-permanent settlement to rebuild your carts and rebuild your tools and all that. But I mean, they just leave. So I mean, probably half of them is going to die on the road again. Not that anyone would care. And this guy Gandalf and Nori are off to do something else in Rune, where this guy Gandalf will, find his power or find the other Istari who are probably going to appear in season 2, I guess, because where's one Istari? I mean, there's many more. So I mean, I guess they will put the other 5 there as well. Saruman and the 2 blue wizards and Radagast. It's only a thought, but again, it feels very forced to put this into the Second Age. Like a lot of stuff in this show. So we go to the second storyline, which is on Númenor. We have Farazon talking to some apprentices of the Architects Guild about a tomb where Tar Palantir will eventually lie. So they have the greatest artisans of Númenor who are going to create this tomb. But I mean, these apprentices can also apply for a design. So Eregion sits there drawing his face. It looks very uncomfortable to just lying there with the crown still on your head. So he has a little bit of drool on his lips, and then Eregion tries to dab it away with a piece of cloth, and he awakes, and he's like, I mean, he thinks she is Miriel, and he talks about restoring the old ways. I mean, and that there's still time to restore the old ways, because otherwise the island is going to drown. Eregion, of course, runs for help. Nobody comes because, I mean, apparently there's no attendants or no guards to the chamber of the king. There's no guards inside the room. You could think that Eregion might have just, slit his throat for all that they care. I mean, apparently they don't really care what happens to their king, so there's nothing of security there. So when she returns, he's like sitting. He opened the door. Of course, that's the room where the Palantir is. He's saying that there's still time. Again, it's very bad dialogue as well. It feels very forced, and the acting, I mean, of the older actor is actually abysmal. It's not really. It feels more like overacting than really just an old man dying. It feels very forced. So Eregion goes to look at the Palantir, the Seeing Stone, which is also, I mean, it's very odd. Of course, the king thinks that she is Miriel, but again, you would guard such a place, not even just the king's tower, but also the king's room, against potential assassins, or maybe have a food taster present who tastes the wine for poison. All of that It feels, again, it feels just, that Eregion is just forced into this story, and not in a good way. Um, it's very random, all of it, and it's very bothersome, overall, and it's one of the main, downsides of this series. So we see that there's one Númenorian ship returning, as I've said for in my review of, um, the last episode, so episode 7, that there was just one ship anymore. There weren't the three ships were. I mean, they were gone. There's two ships just vanished. Um, so we have this one ship. We have Elendil and Miriel talking. I mean, Miriel is blind, so Elendil tries to help her, and she's like, "Don't patronize me." Um, and of course, this statement would be valid for, someone who has been blind for like, decades, who has learned, to live with it and to learn their surroundings. But I mean, she has been blind for like what, maybe a week or something, or a month. Um, we don't know how long. So, um, it's very natural, of course, for people to help each other. So just to disregard this help as patronizing is not fair to Elendil, of course. Um, and then, of course, they start talking a bit about what happened, and he says that, he just, he pulled, um, Galadriel onto his ship because Elendil doesn't, mean he, who sees the stars, but also Elfriend. So it's only natural for him, because of his name apparently, that he helps the elves. But it's more likely just because he is, one of the faithful. Um, and then they arrive in Númenor, and Elendil, he sees a thing, and Miriel, of course, is worried because, I mean, she can probably feel the tension in his body. And then we see all the black flags and all the warships as well. So it seems like the great armament of Númenor has begun, um, for some reason, um, and probably because they, or Ar-Pharazôn at least, wants to sail, east to Middle Earth to, create settlements, even though apparently there already is one, even though he said that, there were no settlements in Middle Earth. But um, I guess whatever, just put everything in at once. I mean, the writers don't care, so, whatever. And it turns out, Ar-Pharazôn is looking and the king, so he might have just, offed him, for all that we know. Um, but now in season 2, I guess it is the rise of Ar-Pharazôn and the downfall of the ways of the faithful. So maybe we can see Elendil, getting locked up together with, all the other faithful, and the Kingsman just taking over the whole island and the whole, you know, government. And then we can finally go to the main storyline of this episode, and it's the elves. So we see Galadriel riding towards Ostin Edil in Eregion, and to be honest, the visuals are incredible. This is an incredibly beautiful city. Um, the only problem I have with this is that it's just a dead city. I mean, there's nothing of activity going on. There's like three people or three elves in the foreground, and the rest of the city is just, it's empty, it's just a void. And it's very weird because Eregion is one of the wealthiest elven realms, in the Second Age. So you would at least expect some more elves, but it's just a dead city. It's just visuals and nothing more. There's no soul to this city. It's just pretty architecture, and nothing more. There's no substance. And we're going to see later in the episode that there is some life in the smaller sets, but in the larger sets like this, it's just visual background and nothing else. Um, we see Elrond and Celebrimbor talking a bit about the solution that Gil-galad wants for the waning of the elves, and he basically says that they have failed, because they don't have enough mithril, and of course, at that moment, Galadriel arrives, fully armored, which is of course a very high burden for her horse. So um, maybe you should have dumped your armor in the Númenorian camp. Maybe that would have been an idea, but apparently not. So there's the elves who help Halbrand, and I mean these helms they they look very spaceship like. They look very alien. Um, Also, I think it's because of the coloring. It's because it's like green and gold, and it's like a weird pattern. It's like they have, you know, painted some strokes of gold onto green helmets, and it doesn't really work. Um, the cloaks are nice. That's nice, but the helmets are they are really ugly. Yeah, I'll have to say it like that. They're really ugly. And you still see that Halbrand has like this massive wound on his body. So at his bed, Galadriel, still in armor, is talking to Elrond, and Elrond asks her, how did you come to be here? And the answer of Galadriel is, wait for it, how did you come to be here? I mean, this is just amazing writing, and if you don't see that, I mean, you're either blind or deaf. Um, it's. I mean, they should win an Oscar for best adapted screenplay for this, because I mean, this dialogue is so emotional, so full of heart, so warming that I mean, you can't just don't shed a tear when you hear this. I mean, when Elrond says, "How did you come to be here?" and Galadriel just answers, "How did you come? How did you come to be here?" I mean, wow, just I mean, top-notch writing. So then Elrond goes like, I mean, yeah, sure, we're going to talk a bit about our adventures. Hooray! So Elrond is like, I mean, I made a mistake, letting you go on that ship, and Galadriel says that she felt like she was not worthy of the honor of going to Valinor, but I think if she just had said it to Gil-galad, like, I don't feel like I should be on this ship, I refuse to go, then he would have said, yeah, okay, fine, alright, you're my, you're my aunt, so, well, I'll listen to you. If you want to stay here in Middle Earth, you can stay. Um, but she didn't, so she just went along, and then she jumped ship. So she says that the only thing she could do after she jumped ship was to swim. Yeah, of course, because otherwise she would have drowned, and maybe that would have been better for the story, but of course not for the lore. You can't just kill Galadriel by drowning. It would be a very lousy death. Just jumping off the ship and drowning or being eaten by that big shark thing. It would be a very unworthy end for Galadriel. Um, but yeah, it's a very weird thing that happens here. From this scene onwards, we have Halbrand who is talking to Celebrimbor as if Celebrimbor were an idiot. I mean, apparently Celebrimbor doesn't know anything about alloys, so when they were talking about mithril, Celebrimbor says it's not enough, and Halbrand says that he should make an alloy. Um, but of course, it's just a small piece, so it would have been diluted too much um, for the required effect. And then Halbrand says, "Yeah, well, just look for the right ore or the right metal to use." And Celebrimbor is like, "Wow, you're so wise in the ways of smithing, even though I'm a master smith who has lived for thousands of years at this point, also around 2,000 years, or over 2,000 years. Um, but I didn't know that, so thank you, human, for sharing your wisdom with me." So it's also one of the main indications of Halbrand, being Sauron, being, yeah, because what he says next, he says, "Consider this knowledge a gift," and of course that's an indication that this form is It's like Anatar, like the Lord of Gifts, but that was a fair and elven form, and this is, a not so fair human form. Um, I mean, he looks healthy and all of that, but he doesn't really look elvish or, you know, like the Lord of Gifts that Tolkien wrote. He's just like, I mean, yeah, you're an idiot, and I know much more of smithing than you do, so this is a gift of me to you. So they start working on it, talking to Gil-galad about their plan, and first plan is to create like a crown um, that Gil-galad gets. Um, but Elrond is like, I mean, we need much more time to do this. Gil-galad says, I mean, there's not enough time to do this. There's not enough time to test this theory. And then Celebrimbor says that what Halbrand says was the key to break the dam. And of course, that gets the attention of Galadriel because, the dam in Osterith broke to create this explosion at Mount Doom and to create this huge pyroclastic flow in which she should have been killed. So she's suspicious for now, or instantly, of Celebrimbor, because he was also saying like this is a power of the unseen world. Um, Galadriel gets more and more suspicious, of course, but Gil-galad says, I mean, there's just no time. I mean, I wanted a solution of you now, but there's no time left. So either we leave the shores or we all die. So he says, disband the city, which is a very weird saying, I think, but I mean, everyone has to go to London and just, I mean, leave Middle Earth or die there. So, Celebrimbor is a bit taken aback, and Galadriel asks him where he heard these words of the unseen world, this power um, above life, above flesh. And he says that he was like convening with his elven smiths, and that he didn't say it, or that these weren't his words. So Galadriel, of course, she is very suspicious now of Sauron, or Halbrand, should we say. So Elrond still tries to, persuade Gil-galad to let them continue. So he says, I mean, give me 3 months, it's what I'm owed. And Gil-galad says, I mean, you're owed nothing, which is true. I mean, Elrond is a subject of the High King, so he should do whatever the High King says. I mean, he went to Khazad-dûm on the orders of the High King, not because he, out of some, charity for the elves. Well, maybe a little bit, but mainly because it was the order of Gil-galad. So it's a very weird dialogue again, where Gil-galad just gives 3 months of time to Elrond for no reason, apparently, but for, I don't know really why. It's very random. It's a very random conversation, and again, it doesn't really add anything to the story, or it's it just shows that Gil-galad is like a pushover. I mean, you can just pressure him a bit, and he gives in to your every demand of you can get a table from him. You can get 3 months time to make a crown out of mithril. You can do everything you want by just pressuring him a little bit, and then it's like, okay, yeah, just do it. I mean, I don't care what you're doing. I'm just the High King of the Noldor in Middle Earth, so I mean, I guess do whatever you want. Um, so Galadriel is then looking at Halbrand, who is like conversing with the other smiths and with Celebrimbor, but she's very suspicious. So she asks this librarian to look into the archives and to look into the kings of the Southlands, but he shouldn't talk about it with anyone, so it should remain a secret. So she's also hiding away from Elrond and Celebrimbor, who pass. So I mean, it's a very secret mission obviously, and she can't do it herself. Apparently, she can't go into the archives herself and look for information. It's someone else who needs to do it because she needs to keep an eye on Celebrimbor and Halbrand, of course. So Halbrand immediately after the scene comes to talk to Galadriel to thank her for saving his life and for doing so much more than that, and that he would never have imagined for someone like him to be there in Eregion with the elves. And then we get an explosion of a kind in Celebrimbor's workshop, and it turns out that they used too much pressure. I mean, what were they expecting? I mean, they were kind of like, for some reason, pressuring the mithril together, like crushing it and doing something. I mean, it's not really clear what they are doing, but apparently they had never heard of, smelting two metals and combining them into one, into one molten mass to, mix it and then get the, required alloy. Um, which again, it's a very stupid scene because it shows that Celebrimbor is just an idiot. He's not this master smith. Um, he is subject to the genius of Halbrand and or Sauron, and the witty remarks of Galadriel, who gives Halbrand like hints for what he should do. So it's very useless and damning for Celebrimbor because he isn't shown as a master craftsman here. He's just, a seemingly, a foolish guy who knows nothing about alloys, knows nothing about smelting and combining different molten ores. So it's very damning and it's bad writing on top of that. So at the same moment, the librarian returns, and Halbrand is also, of course, suspicious when he sees this. So she reads the scroll, and you see this whole family tree, and Halbrand comes up, and Galadriel says, "I mean, you are not the king of the Southlands. I mean, this line was broken 1,000 years ago." Upon which Halbrand says, "Well, I told you that I found this talisman or this token on a dead man," which is true, but she didn't listen. So now it's his fault again, I guess, for not being specific enough, for not saying that he was Sauron in the first place, because that would have saved us a lot of time. Um, that would have saved us also 7 episodes of ludicrous bullshit, to say the least, regarding the lore and regarding the writing. Um, so, of course, Galadriel then tries to kill Halbrand when he says that he has been awake since before the Great Silence was broken. Um, so, meaning that he was created by Ilúvatar together with the rest of the Ainur, so the Valar and the Maiar, before the harmony of the Valar started. So obviously she tries to kill him because she wants Sauron dead, which is of course it's a valid reason to want to kill someone. But she fails and he pushes her into the river, and then she wakes up in a dream back in Valinor, and Finrod is there, who is talking to her under the tree and saying that she should embrace darkness one last time. And he looks very creepy as well. He doesn't really look elvish. He looks very, very creepy in this scene. So after she says that Finrod is dead, she wakes, but again, now on the float with Halbrand, where he's like, yeah, you saved my life, and yeah, I don't want, to destroy. I want to save Middle Earth. And you see this reflection of Sauron and Galadriel, and to be fair, it's a great shot. It's a great visual when they're looking into the water, and then you get just this reflection of Sauron and then Galadriel. So I have no problems with this. It's a very nice visual, But then, of course, you have the main issue of the scene, and it's Halbrand talking to Galadriel, saying that he would make her a queen, like stronger than the foundations of the earth, which is, of course, a line from the Fellowship of the Ring, from the books, and of course from the movies, from um, Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings, and from Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring, of course. But it's very weird that this scene happens there, because it's the temptation of Galadriel when she sees the One Ring, when Frodo offers it to her. So in this scene, there's no reason to use this line except for reusing lines for the books, for for no saying, because they can't write decent dialogue themselves. So they're talking about becoming king and queen. He's like, I mean, I bind you to power and you bind me to the light. I mean, you would be my queen and I would be like the lord, and we could restore Middle Earth to to its power or to its beauty, because what Sauron wanted was not destruction like Melkor. He wanted order and perfection, but not with free will, because of course that can destroy beauty, that can destroy um, order, if you have free will and if you let people um, do whatever they want. So of course this isn't the intention of Sauron. So I mean, again, Galadriel wants to kill Halbrand, um, but he says something very good. He says that, I mean, the elves um, cast her away because she asks for some soldiers, for some more soldiers at least, to hunt for Sauron and to hunt for orcs. But what would they do if they knew that she was allied to Sauron, or that Sauron lives because of her? And then they start screaming because he's like, I mean, I'm alive because of you, and she's like, I'm going to kill you. Uh, and then she's like in this scene that she's basically drowning. So it would be nice to have seen her drown and be rid of her, but of course that can't happen. So she is woken by Elrond. Um, of course, she doesn't really know if this is another trick, so she asks where they first met, and Elrond says, at the water when I was first orphaned, but he isn't really orphaned, and he says that he is half elven without friends or kin. But what about Elros? What about his brother, who was alive when he was, supposedly orphaned, when the havens of Sirion were sacked by the sons of Feanor, and he and Elros were actually taken away by one of the sons of Feanor to be raised, and Elrond's parents are still alive. I mean, Elwing was a half-elven, but she chose to be immortal, and Earendil is like floating around in the stars with his wagon. Um, so again, it's a very odd thing that people would know this. I mean, elves would have told Elrond that his father was now a star and that his mother was living in the immortal lands. So he isn't really an orphan in the strict sense of the word, but because he has no parents near to him, you could say that he is semi-orphan. Well, not really though. I mean, it doesn't really work. Um, but it shows again that um, the people writing this show, they don't really know what to do with the lore, so they just pick off little bits here and there and then put it together as they wish, um, with characters not being there, being at a place where they shouldn't be, um, events happening at times that they shouldn't, and conversations like this that make no sense in the terms of the lore. But I mean, this scene was one of the minor lore breaking scenes of this series. Um, so, but in the general overview of this episode, again, it makes more sense, at least. I mean, that she would go after him and ask him who he really is, or if he is at least not a dream. So this makes sense, but what he says makes no sense. Um, so then she runs off, of course, to find Celebrimbor and to try and maybe stop the process of making this crown or these rings. So they convene, and we have the Great Council of the Elves. For you know, without Gil-galad, who just left, and he's like, I mean, I don't care about these rings or about anything that's being done in your city. So I mean, he's just he comes to Eregion, doesn't even stay the night. He's just like, I mean, you can't continue, and he's off again. Instead of just writing a letter or something saying that if they don't have a solution, they should come to London and abandon the city. But apparently this doesn't happen, so Gil-galad is just gone again, and he is replaced by Elrond. So Galadriel finally gives up her dagger because Celebrimbor needs gold and silver from Valinor to to create these rings, these mithril rings, because the mithril doesn't want to be bound with common silver or common gold, so it needs to be exceptionally pure. So we can assume that the gold and silver is 100% pure in Valinor, which is incredible. So only then the mithril can be bound to it. So we get this molten gold and silver and steel or iron perhaps from the blade, and Celebrimbor throws this piece of mithril inside. So it looks very much like the eye, doesn't it? So then, while the rings are being forged, Elrond goes to the river and finds this scroll, and of course then he knows what has happened and why Galadriel says that Halbrand isn't a part of the plans anymore, and why Halbrand has just vanished. He is just he's shocked, presumably, because he also sees that there's no king of the Southlands. And then we get this shot of the three rings. And what I want to say about this shot is, even though it looks very nice, it also doesn't make sense, because you have these three rings. You have Nanya, the ring of adamant, which is of course with the white stone. You have Vilya, the ring of sapphire, which is the blue stone, of course, and then we have Narya, or the ring of fire, with the red stone. But as you can see here, it's clear that even though all three rings came from the same mixture of gold, silver, steel, and mithril, they are different, or at least Nanya and the other two rings are different, because the showrunners and writers probably read that Nanya is made from mithril, and yeah, it looks like it's made from mithril, but it doesn't make sense, because the other two rings are clearly more gold, and we know that Vilya was made of gold, but that of the metal with which Narya was made, we don't know. So it could be mithril, it could be gold, it could be silver, it could be even iron, but we don't know that. So it's very odd that they just mix all these metals together and then have two rings that are the same, and then one ring that is clearly different and made from a different metal. So this isn't thought through. So they want to keep this lore, they want to keep the visuals, but in making it so that all these three metals are like mixed together, you can't have these two rings that are the same and then one ring that's clearly distinct. So again, it isn't thought through. It is like what I said before. It's like picking bits of the lore wherever you want it, and then place it wherever you want it in the show. You can place characters wherever and whenever you want, and you can place objects and pieces of exposition whenever and wherever you want, but they can't keep it consistent. They keep using this lore and the background and creatures and all of that, but they don't really know what to do because they're not good writers. And you see it in this, that you just say, I mean, yeah, we have an idea, we'll just show them mixing gold and silver and mithril together. But then you have three rings that should be looking the same, and not two rings that look the same and one ring that looks different. Um, and even though it may be coming off as nitpicking, um, it's very important because it has to do with consistency and with good storytelling. And it's clear that these writers don't know what to do, um, and that they have no clue whatsoever what they are going to do with lore, with characters, with events, with even these tiny objects. Um, that they shouldn't have been made already, because we should have seen the making of the 9 rings and of the 7 rings before this, before these rings were made by Celebrimbor and by the elves alone. So um, yeah, it's like we want to create these 3 rings, but yeah, whatever. It's like they don't actually care about the lore. They just think, I mean, this piece of lore is nice, this visual is nice. Let's just put them together and disregard the consequences. It's more like that than actually good storytelling. So then we have one final scene, and it's Halbrand, Sauron, returning to Mordor, presumably to kill Adar, to reclaim his orcs, and then go forge the One Ring in Mount Doom. Even though, I mean, we don't have the 9 rings, we don't have the 7 rings. Um, so that concludes the story for this episode and for the first season. And to be fair, I really had issues throughout this episode and throughout previous episodes of keeping my head clear and keeping to the story and watching the story, and writing down lines, because I forgot half of the lines just after they were said, because often they are so incredibly stupid or so forgettable that you're just forgetting them or ignoring the lines, or you're ignoring characters in the end because they're just useless, or you don't feel any affection to them, like the Harfoots. I mean, they could have all died in the fire when the weirdo was burning down the whole forest, and I wouldn't have cared, because we don't really have this connection to these characters. Well, maybe people who are oblivious to the lore, or haven't read The Lord of the Rings, or have read The Lord of the Rings and just like to see hobbits. Maybe people who can just separate the lore from this show, maybe they can, create an affectionate bond towards his character. But I think a lot of people who are really invested in Tolkien and in the lore, they can't really separate it, because like me, I really have issues to see this as a separate show, or as something that is separate from, for example, the Peter Jackson trilogy, um, because it isn't dislocated from that. It is, it's a prequel series. So when the writer said that they wanted to be a story that stands on its own, um, you could do that, for example, with Numenor, and with the Forging of the Rings, you can create an episodal series with these events being portrayed throughout the time of the Second Age, with, of course, then eventually this overarching story of Sauron and the return of Mordor and Anatar and the war of the elves and Sauron, and eventually the Great Alliance. But of course, in the end, you can't really separate it from the Lord of the Rings, because it's factually not a story that stands on its own. It's connected. It's history. Like, I mean, you can't just separate the Roman Republic from the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, you can't separate these stories, even though there's a lot of time between them. But you know, they are connected. These stories are connected, and these histories are connected. So um, the problem is that the writers don't understand it, and they don't understand the lore, or they don't want to read the lore, and they're saying that, I mean, that Galadriel is true to Tolkien, which she factually isn't, which I have explained in a previous video. But you have what I've said before in this episode already several times. It's that they pick, bits of lore, they place them together, either in a completely different setting where it's not fitting, or they create their own lore around it and it doesn't work. Like, of course, the Silmaril being the origin for Mithril, which is absolutely nonsensical. And this is just a problem with the show. And even though they say that the show is going to get bigger and better and more magnificent, I fear for it. And I fear for the legacy of Tolkien, because this isn't Tolkien. This is Amazon, and yeah, it shows why these writers have failed so many times, and why their pitches have been ignored so many times. This is just a terribly bad show. It doesn't do honor to Tolkien. It doesn't do honor to Peter Jackson's creation, which still is, I mean, the best fantasy movie series to date. And I really don't say it lightly, because there's a lot of fantasy series and a lot of fantasy films of adaptations of books, that there are, but in scope, in magnitude, Peter Jackson, his trilogy is the best fantasy trilogy that is out there, or the best fantasy series, or best fantasy movies that are out there, and they're not entirely true to the books either. But people can see that they wanted to tell a story um, that was Tolkien, and even though they changed little bits of events, and some of which were unnecessary, but people were willing to forgive him that, because it was a story that they all loved, and it's true to the books. Um, it's very true to books. It's mostly true to the books. I would say, it's similar to Harry Potter, which these films are also very true to the books, and they follow the books very well. I mean, they change little bits here and there as well for the story's sake. Um, but that's a huge contrast to this series and to other series that have been made, like the Shannara Chronicles, like Earthsea, like The Wheel of Time, and of course now Amazon: The Rings of Power. It's wanting to create a show about an IP, but still wanting to do whatever you want, yourself, whatever you want to put in yourself, and that is really damning. It's not filmmaking or series making for the sake of being true to a book, or to honor an author or his work or her work, but it's just wanting to grab onto an IP and then pour in whatever you want yourself. I think that Rings of Power is the clearest example and the most well-known example now of how not to approach a fantasy adaptation. So I'm going to leave you there. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this episode, what you thought of this reaction, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.